Lavender Literary Society members and guests, good evening and welcome. Tonight, we're honored to present Eric C. Watt's book, Love Your Asian Body, AIDS Activism in Los Angeles, winner of the Outstanding Achievement Award in History for 2023, presented by the Association for Asian American Studies. A community memoir, Love Your Asian Body connects the deeply personal with the uncompromisingly political in telling the stories of more than 30 Asian American AIDS activists. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I'm the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ Museum, a new cultural institution dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ history and culture. Our vision is a world where all people experience the joy of liberation. I am a Black woman with curly hair. I'm wearing glasses with a gold frame, red lipstick, and gold hoop earrings. While our first physical galleries are still a few years into the future, our work as a museum is already underway. Over the past 3 years, we have produced a robust slate of free public programming with partners across the country, toured an award-winning exhibition to 5 major US cities, and launched our Lavender Literary Society book club, which you get to experience this evening. When we opened our doors as New York City's newest museum, we'll tell the stories of queer people across time, place, and identity. The museum will be a space for celebration, remembrance, and connection, a place where queer magic is real, our ancestors are honored, and our stories are told with power and pride. But you don't have to wait to be part of our story. You can join us now through public programs like this one, traveling exhibitions, subscribing to our newsletter, joining our book club, or by becoming a founding member. Every gift of support, every act of visibility helps build this museum from the ground up. And you can learn more about the American LGBTQ Museum at americanlgbtqmuseum.org. For those of you joining the Lavender Literary Society for the first time this evening, we'd like to begin by sharing a bit about our book club. The American LGBTQ Museum's book club is a space for community and connection, bridging generations through the magic of storytelling. Our titles are a mix of popular queer history and memoir with inspiring authors and iconic guest facilitators. Through virtual and in-person gatherings, we aim to ignite intergenerational dialogue and foster understanding, empathy, and unity. Together, we traverse the landscapes of queer culture, savoring the nuances and complexities that make our stories uniquely ours. This isn't just a book club, it's a movement. Reading together becomes a powerful act and a catalyst for change, a testament to the resilience of the LGBTQ spirit. Participants like you will be part of something extraordinary. And in this book club, we won't just read, we'll weave the threads of our stories into a tapestry of strength, resilience, and pride. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Eric C. Watt. Eric C. Watt is the author of 4 books, including Daddy Issues, winner of the Barbara D. Bernard Prize in Fiction, Love Your Asian Body, AIDS Activism in Los Angeles, winner of the Outstanding Book in History Award from the Association of Asian American Studies, the Los Angeles Times best-selling debut novel Swim, and The Making of a Gay Asian Community, an oral history of pre-AIDS Los Angeles. His second novel manuscript, Drive, was a finalist in the Black Lawrence Immigrant Writing Series in 2022. Eric strives to tell stories, fictional or otherwise, not only about communities that have been overlooked, but also about those stories that even those communities find inconvenient and uncomfortable. You can learn more about his work at ericwattsbooks.com. And we're happy to welcome our host, Alice Y. Hom. Alice is a community builder invested in bridging diverse and overlapping communities for social change. She's executive director of Change Philanthropy. Previously, she served as the director of equity and social justice at Northern California Grantmakers and as the Queer Justice Fund director at Asian Americans Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. Alice serves on the board of the American LGBTQ Museum and on the advisory council for the Conscious Style Guide, a resource on inclusive, respectful truthful, and empowering language on ability, disability, age, ethnicity, gender, race, sexuality, and socioeconomic status. She's a co-founder of Beyond Two Cents, LGBTQ AAPI Giving Circle. Her previous board service includes Borealis Philanthropy, California Humanities, Los Angeles City Commission on the Status of Women, Astria Lesbian Foundation for Justice, Visual Communications, Great Leap, and APAIT Health Center. Alice holds a PhD in history from Claremont Graduate University, a master's in Asian American Studies from UCLA, and a BA from Yale University. And without further ado, we welcome Eric and Alice to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Suhaili. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here with you and to be in conversation with my dear friend and comrade, Eric C. Watt. Before we kick it off, I want to just identify myself. I am a queer Asian American, female identified and gender nonconforming person. I wear glasses. I have short black hair. I'm also wearing a short sleeve shirt with red flowers and blue and green stripes. And I'll have Eric introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So my name is Eric Watt, and I'm a queer, cisgender Asian American man, a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong. Now I'm middle-aged. I wear glasses too. These are new ones, the round ones. And my hair is straight and long and almost shoulder length, black on top, blue on the bottom. I'm wearing a gray shirt, short-sleeved.
Thank you, Eric. And to kick us off, Eric, I'm really excited to talk to you. Could you give us a bit of an overview of your history book, Love Your Asian Body, AIDS Activism in Los Angeles, an overview, and then you're going to read a short bit from your book.
Yeah, so the book really chronicles the Asian American AIDS movement, specifically in Los Angeles. It charts especially the growth of Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, APIT, which Alice, you were involved with, and I was a volunteer at one point. It started out as sort of group of men and women group of people just trying to provide mutual aid to the community because folks in the Asian American community, especially queer folks, were not getting the information and support that they needed. And then over time, they became much more established, but still holding to the grassroots and multiracial progressive values that they started out with. So the books all chronicle that development over time. But I would say up until the mid 90s. So. The part that I'm going to read is actually from the first chapter. It's an interview that I did with Gil McGowan, who was at one time a staff at the Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, APIT, and his partner, Juan Lombard. And they were both very active in different progressive movements, leftist movement in the 1970s. And they met after Gil lost his first true love, she would say. But Juan came around and, he was able to find love again. But at the time, the 70s and also in the 80s, there were a lot of open and closed relationships. And so they were open and closed at different times. But just when they were ready to close the relationship in the late 80s, they were, I think, they were about 40s at the time. Gil found out that he was HIV positive. So I want to take the story from there. So one morning after he returned to LA, Gil woke up and just felt terrible. I felt like I had the flu, I was cold, I was sweating, I had a fever, I I was nauseous. Gil went to the Gay and Lesbian Community Services Center to get tested for HIV. In those days, people had to wait a week for test results. Gil remembered that people in the waiting room were always distant and kept to themselves. The only ripple of emotion came when a person came out of the room with the light step of someone who had tested negative, spared for a little while longer. The mood returned to somber when the counselor called the next number. The person with the number before Gil came out with a light step. Then Gil said, "The counselor called my number." He continued to say, "I walked into his office. He shut the door. He said, 'Have a seat.' He was on the opposite side of the desk. He asked me, 'Well, what do you think the result is?' I paused. It was a point of admission and not acceptance yet, but I began to admit, 'I am positive,' he said. He said, yeah. My life stood still momentarily. Too many things flying around. What do I tell Juan? How do I tell my family? Is he going to leave me? Who do I call? What do I do next? He asked me, the counselor asked me if I was okay. I said, yeah, yeah, yeah. I walked out of the counseling. I was oblivious. I was just walking straight to the door. I knew then when I opened that door, I was stepping into the brand new world. When I asked Gil how he shared this news with Juan, he couldn't remember. He was so surprised by his lapse of memory that he asked me to pause the recording so that he could think about it. Then he said that we should ask Juan. A month later, when I interviewed both of them together, Gil remained befuddled by his memory loss. He said, I don't know if part of it was the wanting to blank it out because it was so traumatic. Juan's memory was sketchy too, but Juan knew one thing for certain. There was never a thought about dropping the relationship. He still admired Gil, and he wasn't about to leave him for a mistake. Juan's brother had died of AIDS at 28. Juan himself worked in the AIDS ward in Los Angeles County. There's a certain part of me, he said, that understands this is part of what the community has to go through. We all have to be part of it, even though I thought somehow we could escape that. Didn't I pay enough? How much more do I have to give up for it? That's what was disappointing about it. That neither Gil nor Juan remembered that conversation surprised me. After all, this was the most critical moment in the relationship, I thought. They could recall lesser events that happened earlier in their lives, while they relished the telling of the more mundane moments of married life. But curiously, that day drew a blank for both. Maybe it was, as Gil said, too traumatic, though there were other stories they told, like those about the deaths of loved ones, that drew tears from these otherwise strong if weathered men. Then what Juan said finally sank in. Among many gay men of their generation, there was an acceptance of AIDS as a constant in their lives. Even if you didn't have the virus, you lived with it in some way. Dwelling on it, not moving on, was equal to paralysis. What is admirable to me was Gil's and Juan's determination not to let the virus take more from them or to change fundamentally who they were. Social justice warriors who made a commitment to each other and to the movement. In describing his own experience, Rick Parrish, who is the co-founder of APIT, tells a story common to many gay men during that time. He said, when I came out, there was no AIDS. I made my debut in 1978 on Castro Street, San Francisco, the tail end of the sexual revolution. I walked down the street, I was 18, and I was in paradise. Gay men everywhere, clubs everywhere, nothing to fear. It was a very different time. It wasn't until a year later when I was a student at UC Riverside that we started hearing about this gay cancer that was happening in New York. Everyone was saying, oh, it's the S&M crowd. I wasn't scared because I wasn't into S&M. I wasn't doing poppers. I wasn't doing all the things that all the judgments people were making on what it meant to get HIV. And we hadn't seen the full impact. We thought it was just a plot by the Reagan administration, a conspiracy to get us to stop having sex. AIDS materialized from a complicated vortex of repression and rebellion and quickly changed the rules. How would you tell those who had cherished such sexual freedom that they must now see bodily fluids as poison, put up barriers in the most intimate of sexual acts, submit to the trepidation and humiliation of testing every 6 months, disclose their status like a scarlet letter every time they become close to someone? How could any of this not sound like a return trip to the Dark Ages? How could they not be suspicious that this was just another ploy to shame them into normalcy or to blame the victims? After all, those who perpetrated homophobia wielded the same weapon to fan AIDS paranoia. Thank you.
Eric, is it possible for you to show the cover of the book?
Oh,
I
yeah.
blurred. Yeah. Um, I I want to know, could you say why you chose the title Love Your Asian Body?
Yeah, so Love Your Asian Body was actually the first social marketing campaign that these activists did when APIT become more formal. They got some money and they were going to do this campaign to tell people about like getting tested. Um, and and they named the campaign Love Your Asian Body. The co-founders, Rick Parrish, whom I just shared a little bit of his experience, and Joel Tan kind of came up with the idea. There's a little story about how that happened in here. And it was such a monumental moment in my life to hear Love Your Asian Body. It sounds like such a simple concept, but it's something that bared to be said out loud and internalized because at that time there was racism in the queer community. There's homophobia that we're dealing with everywhere, including in our home community. So it's really hard to integrate. And AIDS kind of made sex very dangerous and scary. And I have to say, I was celibate for a long time because I was so scared of getting HIV when I was young. So to say love your Asian body, not only as a way to like love it enough that to protect it, right? But also love it because everyone else everywhere else we're denied of that self-love, right? So or the people didn't want us to love ourselves was almost like a double message. It was so powerful for me. And then it's just become a rallying cry for many people in my peer generation, to really advocate for ourselves. So that's why I used it as the title for the book.
Thank you for that. And I remember that campaign because you're talking about what's the time period that you're talking about, Eric, right now?
This is, I think, 1991 or 1992.
Yeah. And then AIDS started in 80s. I just want to give
Yeah,
people.
yeah, absolutely. I usually do a timeline on the slide because
Yeah.
even the of us who went through it don't remember. The first cases that was official was detected in 1980. ACT UP, for example, was founded in 1987. That was
Mhm.
in response to the inaction. Like after so many years, when the government didn't do anything about it, people decided to do something, So, and APIT kind of started around the same time too, but didn't become formal until a few years later. And yeah, it wasn't even named AIDS, I think, until a few years after 1980 when it was called gay related infectious disease, I believe. Yeah.
Like that, yeah. And I want to be, just mindful about this, naming the time period and then naming what was happening on in the 80s and the 90s. You yourself talked about seeing this campaign in the early 90s. I remember it too, because what I remember is not the gay men or the gay male bodies that I saw, which was like they're naked, they're on top of each other. I almost wish I had one of those stickers that
Yeah.
I kept probably somewhere in my archive somewhere. But
It's this one.
yeah, so so you kind of right there. And so what I remember is the two women on the other side, because this was not just aimed towards men. It was about men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women, women and men who are bisexual have sex with multiple, people of different genders. So it was a way for us to actually see Asian American queer people, which was not very visible and uh, commonplace at that time. So thank you for that. And
Yeah.
Eric, maybe you could talk a little bit about your own history. You're a community historian. You've documented Asian American Pacific Islander LGBTQ activism over the years. What's your personal connection to this movement and to API LGBTQ activism?
Yeah, I was a volunteer. I was doing outreach, street outreach. I would be standing a lot of times in front of a gay bar. And if we see, it's all visual, done visually. If we see an Asian man coming out, then we try to hand him some flyer or maybe a safe sex packet, and try to talk to them about safe sex behavior. That's one of the things that I did. I would say that also, I didn't realize at the time because I thought this is all just people having fun, but we will have like dances, we'll have like slumber parties that staff would organize and cookouts and all the stuff that I would go to. And all of that, I realized as I was writing this book, it's all prevention, right?
Mhm.
But it's not individual tell you something and what to do, and then you do a type of one-on-one intervention, but more like a community building intervention. So I was definitely much more very involved in that. And you were also, I mean, we kind of met around that period, but not directly through AIDS. So that was in the background too, because a lot of people that we met, or a lot of people that we knew at the time, were in some way very active in the movement as well, our peers.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think folks think about activists or activist history as something removed from them, but you participate in a community. You don't have to be well known or famous to be, an activist or to be recognized. And I'm curious for you, Eric, you talked about APIT. So APIT is Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, and now it's a health center after so many years. But what made you want to write this history and document it? Because I'm curious.
Yeah.
APIT, the history, is still around in Los Angeles. It started in the early 90s, still around. Um, what can you tell us about what inspired you to make this history, write this book? And so, yeah, what inspired you? Was there an epiphany about it? When did you start
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. It's this is my second oral history book. My first one was also specifically about the gay Asian men's community in Los Angeles, and I was very strategic in ending that history or that documentation of that history with the beginning of AIDS because I knew AIDS was going to change everything,
Mhm.
right? And it's almost like I didn't want to touch it, both academically, but also personally. I felt like I might be too close to it, and since then I moved on to fiction, especially in the last decade or so. So I always tell myself I'm done with nonfiction. I'm done with doing academic work, history work. But what happened was Trump 1.0, right? And I would remember having dinner with a group of friends, many of them I met in the 90s through AIDS movement that we still kept in contact in community really still to this day. And I was just having this conversation or I was saying this thought out loud that I because I was so devastated by what happened with the 2016 election and all the stuff that was happening with all the travel ban and much more at the time that we knew much things are going to get only get worse, right? I need to harken back to a time for myself where things are really dire and desperate, but yet there was still hope and joy and community building, And then I looked across the table and there are all these people that I met during that period. Right? It's like this is like evidence that we will get through this, right? So that idea comes like, okay, maybe I need to write about this. Maybe I need to change my tune and say like this is my next book. Whatever I'm writing fiction in terms of fiction, I need to put a hold on it and then just focus on this. And then right after that, I had a conversation with Yuri Candelario, who is still the director of APIT now. Um, and and I asked him like, if I do this, I will only do it if I can do a collaboration with you, because I don't think you're not all historian too, Alice, so you might be able to relate to this. Like sometimes I just feel like it's just not my story to tell sometimes, even though people give me permission to tell these stories, right? So I want to do in collaboration with the community, and jury immediately said yes. And threw some resources into it. We raised some money. I wasn't part of academia, so at that time I did not have any resources, and I didn't have a publisher in mind. I just knew that I have to write this, and then something will happen. So
Yeah.
that was the origin of it. And the next person we talked to was Dean Goishi, who's no longer with us. And we also knew that like he was such a big part of this history. He is one of those people that if he said like I don't want to be interviewed, I wouldn't be able to tell the story either. But thankfully he said yes pretty readily too.
Yeah. So Dean Koishi was a former executive director of APAT and helped start before when you said it wasn't even a nonprofit organization. And I love how these things is like you just have a group of people who noticed that there was something missing, that public services, healthcare was not available, or um, just support
Yeah,
for Asian American gay men who had AIDS,
yeah.
and no one was helping them. So, um, can you share more about the interviews that you did? Because this is an oral history, you're a community historian, you're not
Mm.
affiliated with an academic institution. I hope this gives people, like you don't have to be an academic to document, to write, to share a story. I have like so many different questions going on, but I appreciate this because I think you and I believe that it's regular people who make
Yeah.
up this history, our history, etc. Can you say more about the oral histories you did, and were there stories from talking and interviewing people that come to mind that are in the book that you want to share with us? Like, I think people need to know this story.
Yeah, so many, so many. I think like we both came from this ethnic studies tradition that really believe it's everyday people that made history. It's not like only people in power, right? And in fact, that history is often overshadowed, or even if it's exists at all, so or if it's documented at all. So I I think one of the benefit of being in collaboration with Jury and APIT is now I have not only access, but also some sort of like a seal of approval in reaching out to these people and say, hey, this is legit. Like, so I talked to a lot of folks who were at the time, as at one point, staff at APIT. I talked to a couple of clients too, actually, who were very active at the time and got the stories. We really want to reach out to folks who are survivor, especially who are HIV positive, people like Gil. We felt that their stories, like especially their voices, especially important in this history. And I think the ones that and part of this is maybe just people like the maybe it's the cultural value around humility when I reach out to people, and you might have the same experience too, Alice. When you talk about people of color, women of color, that that they might say, oh, I didn't do that much. It's like I don't have that much story to tell, And Dean said this. Dean, the director, said this. you know, so um so that have to kind of coach them and saying, like I'm not looking for like earth-shattering information. Like I'm not saying you led the charge in one campaign or whatever. So there's some coaxing that I have to do, and for some folks, but some are just ready to talk because I felt like it's been 20, 25 years since they were part of that movement, and there is a lot of trauma. And I think people also hope that this could help process some of that too, right? So the one example that I would share is the brother and mother of James Sakakura, uh, who passed away, I think, in the 90s, around like mid to late 90s of HIV, of AIDS complications. And so I knew, well, obviously I couldn't interview him, but he was such an important part of the project, I mean, history, because not only was he an activist, and everyone just loved James. Almost every man I talked to had a crush on James, including me, right?
He was handsome, you know.
He's just so handsome. And and he was a poet, he's sensitive, and he's just like, but he did all this work around the activism. He passed away, and his death affected people so much,
Yeah.
right? It's one of those things that like kind of people need to recover from, right? So I thought like, I wish I could somehow tell that story. I reached out to his brother. He was my dentist at one point. He was dentist to many of us because I think because of James' status, he made it a point to offer pro bono services to people with HIV. If
Wow.
folks don't remember, like HIV and dentistry did not have a really great history in the move in the AIDS crisis, right? Because dentists was afraid, a lot of dentists not understanding how HIV, even after they understood how HIV is transmitted, still refused to treat people with HIV. So James's brother Mark sort of made this effort. And so a lot of folks in APIT, include like staff and volunteers, including myself, sort of sought him out, and he was my dentist for like a couple of years. I said, hey, I really want to talk to you. And then he said, oh, I can talk to you, but you should also talk to my 88-year-old mom, you know? So we literally went to her facility. I don't remember if it's a nursing home or it's assisted living facility in South Bay, I think in Torrance, and had this conversation. She was in her late 80s, like I said. And every time, and she was so honest. She was so candid about all the struggles that James was going through because, he had a lot of addiction problem, which kind of led to the HIV status, right? So she was so honest about it. She's been his advocate from the very beginning, and I think unwavering. And she talked more than Mark, her eldest son. It was such a great story to be included, right? Um, And I still get chills. And I think that one of those stories that as I was typing out the story, the things that she was telling me, I started crying. I had to step away. I had to walk around the room, calm down, and come back. And I had to do that like multiple times, to finish that chapter. And then I worried. This is the part where I worried. It's like, am I dredging up like all this pain for an 88-year-old woman? Maybe, like her son passed away like more than 20 years ago, and then now she's talking about it. So I have a lot of like anxiety about writing that chapter, about getting it right and
Mhm.
striking the right tone, right? And being very as candid as she is with me, as she was with me, but without being sensationalistic or without kind of using it to make a too much score a point or something. So yeah, that was a very like delicate chapter to write. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And what I appreciate is that this story is not just the Asian American gay men, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
Asian American lesbians who are also there for the Asian American gay men. It's about like the parents or the family who were there, or some who were not there for their siblings or their family members who had AIDS or HIV. Um, I'm curious to talk more about like the gender dynamics in the book in terms of because when people think about different histories of gay lesbian history. They think of lesbian separatists, and depending on how much you know about gay lesbian history, they think about in the 70s about lesbian separatism, and the 80s, 90s they think about the lesbians and bisexual women who supported the gay men. Like basically, gay men were dying, and we're like, okay, who's gonna step up? The lesbians stepped up, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you want to say more that was kind of you kind of know that story in the general maybe LGBTQ sense, but what about this in a very specific um people of color, Asian American sense? Like sometimes people think like the community of Asian Americans they were like less open about homosexuality, or that they were more homophobic than any other community. And I think my research, your research has always shown that it's not. It's just the same. But because people don't know a lot about Asian American history, the perception or the misconception is that, oh, they're more homophobic, they don't speak English, so they do this, etc. And we all know that that's just bullshit talking.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
you know,
Absolutely.
they're immigrants and they don't know, so can you share a little bit more about add
Yeah.
some color there?
Yeah, yeah. I do want to go back to the point about like the presumptions of homophobia in the cultural community too. So I'll make a note. It was a little bit challenged to also think about how I would talk about the participation of women, especially lesbians, queer women, in um, in the movement. Uh, Sometimes I would say they're allies, but when I say that, I was like, oh, they're not just allies, because allies imply that they were not part of it. They were sort of, because there were women who were HIV positive,
Right.
and the activists would educate me that, and they were the ones who were not getting the help because all the drugs and treatment modalities were experimented on men. So
Mhm.
sometimes when these symptoms showed on women, in fact, the medical community would say, "Oh, it's not an AIDS symptom, it's not HIV symptom." You know, so a lot of women died very quickly. Women with HIV died very quickly because their symptoms were not recognized by the medical community,
Mhm.
right? So there was a lot of but at the same time, the history also show when the budget was being slashed, when there's a shortfall for whatever reason, it's the women's programming that gets the axe, right? So there's still a lot of I always say this like we don't uh even though we say HIV AIDS is not a gay man thing, but we still run the movement like it's a gay man thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's still kind of mentality when it comes to that. But I do think that I think before, at least in LA, before HIV and AIDS, the organizing among LGBTQ Asian American community was very gender segregated. I think AIDS offer a place for people to come together, as imperfect as it is. In fact, there was a whole chapter about sexism that happened in AIDS organizing that led to a rift that I don't think was still resolved or restored to this
Mhm.
day, right? You were in part of it, you know. So I mean, you were very involved in sort of like trying to have people talk to each other about that episode. So it's a very complicated history. The other thing I would say too is that mutual care or mutual aid community care model came from the women. It's not
Yep.
only that, like you're right, like because gay men were dying and the women, especially lesbians and bisexual and queer women, stepped up and filled the void because gay men were dying. Um, but we also learned that from previous struggle around breast cancer too, right? Because that was another instance where the government was not paying enough attention to it.
Yeah.
And the ironic thing is as AIDS funding goes dramatically up, breast cancer funding stay flat or went down,
Yeah.
right? So, and you don't see the same sort of fight that gay men had for really elevating that issue, right? So there's a lot of stuff that was happening around gender too. Um,
Thanks, Eric. And I want to bring that up because I was a part of APIT. I was on the board, and part of the group that helped start the women's program at APIT. And what I think is really interesting is not just queer women who are part of it; it's straight API women who are part of it too. So it was like, oh, when I think now about like, oh, that's not my issue. It's like every issue is your issue, whether you're actually personally impacted or not.
right.
So, we have um, straight women who are part of the women's program hired at APIT, a straight woman and a queer woman who are part of it, both Asian American, also going out to the parties. And I think this is where what I'm happy about your book is that it complicates multiple things and multiple issues. Like, is a gay issue because it impacts gay people, or is it, so we don't have to ask that question because that's the wrong question. It's like, how are we addressing it? How are we, trying to move it? And your example of breast cancer, funding flat and AIDS funding going up, it speaks to the sexism of policies, et cetera. So I
Totally.
what you're doing is complicating it, and I know you want to talk about homophobia and and culture and in people of color communities. Why don't you speak to that, and then I'll ask you another one.
Yeah, and one of the people that I talked to was this straight woman who so also at that time in the early 90s, there weren't a lot of queer folks, queer AP, Asian American folks who have degree in social work and public health. AIDS actually kind of changed that because in order to stay in the AIDS movement as it become professionalized, you need to get a degree. So that changed it at some point. But in the beginning, we were really relying on folks who have that credential, and there were a few exceptions, but for the most part, um, people who were initially the clinician in the movement were not necessarily queer. And I interviewed this woman who's now retired, who's straight, Margaret Endo, um, and and she didn't know anything about queer people,
Mm,
but she had the professional training. She had to learn really fast,
mm,
right? And she would, but I think sort of this chapter was also one of my favorite chapters too, because again, very humble, didn't want to be interviewed because you didn't think like only stay there for a year, but she helped set up the program for them, right? And she got pregnant and she moved on. And then she'll share the story about like dealing with a family. Um, someone who has HIV, someone who's Japanese American, and then had a father who was what the young man thought was not going to understand. And a lot of her work is really about like helping this person disclose who he was to his parents. And the way that she went about doing it, in the end, um, she was telling me that like in the end, this person got to die in the parents' home,
mm,
cared for by his parents. Like his dad was taking him to the bathroom because toward that it's really hard, right? A lot of things are hard, a lot of basic functions are hard. So like he was cleaning him up, he was carrying him from bed to bed bathroom, and all of that, right? And that was always touched me. Like people assume, even this young man assumed
Yeah.
that the parents, because of all these cultural expectations, we were being told that, Asian cultures is homophobic,
Yeah.
right? But it's just that we never had those conversations.
Mhm.
And we never had that connections to the issue, right? So it's always stay abstract. But once we're confronted with it, I'm not saying every single Asian parent is going to rise to the occasion, but in this case, he did. And there are many cases like that, right? And people struggled. Yeah.
Even James Sakura's mother,
Yeah.
who she's telling you the story about him and the struggle that he had, she told you that about him. And you're I'm always, sometimes um I think what this speaks to for me is the lack of information that we have about Asian
Right.
American Pacific Islander history
Right.
within the US. And so we don't have enough of that information available to us. So I think there's, right now you said you were inspired to do this in the first Trump era. We're in the second Trump era now, right? And things have like, really gone downward. And I was gonna say like to hell. And so we're now like history's being rewritten, history's being erased.
Yeah.
Stonewall, they're trying to take down the Stonewall Memorial. They're trying to take down we
The
can't
Mastodon, the
we can't
camp.
say slavery was bad, I mean like some
Yeah.
very um just known things we can't say now if it's going to like make a white person feel uncomfortable. So I'm curious for you around, documenting these stories, like the importance of like an American LGBTQ plus museum, shout out to the museum. I'm on their board too. But it's like how important it is to keep these histories, keep these stories, because they're being erased right now, they're being rewritten, and they're uh I mean, even to talk about it in higher education, things are, First Amendment, like, we were censored now for these things. I don't even know if I have a question there, but I think my question is like, you brought up this book talks about surviving. And I'm curious how you think about this book can help with current day, like where
Mhm.
we are and surviving that and surviving where we are right now.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot because the thing that drove me to write this book, 8 years ago, like things get shittier, right? In the Trump 2.0. So do I still feel this way, right? And I think the things that I learned, even though I went through this period personally as a volunteer, sort of somewhat peripheral, kind of, and
Adjacent.
adjacent, which kind of made me in some way, a perfect way to tell the story, right? Because I'm not in it so close to it, but I'm in it enough to know what to ask and what's important. But in any case, I felt like there are two things that I took from this history that I still carry with me today. One is to your point about history being erased, right? That we need to keep having uncomfortable conversations because that's what the AIDS activists did,
Mhm,
right? They knew that it's easy to reach people like me. I was college educated.
mhm,
I know where to find resources.
mhm,
I know where to get tested. I know where to buy a condom. But the people that they needed to reach the most, they always knew the activists and the organizers always knew that was the immigrants that might be monolingual, non-English speaking, that are not exposed to these images, but might still be engaging in risky sexual behavior, right? Or drugs. So, but to reach them, they had to work with organizations and people that might not want to have these conversations about sex and death, gay sex and death, right?
mhm,
Then they push and they find people who have the linguistic capacity and then the relationship with these organizations. They find their allies in the straight community, and that helped really push it through. But it's really, I would say that even though I'm HIV negative, I benefited so much from that, right? Because in doing that, they really elevated LGBTQ people,
Right.
right? And humanized us, right? I think you saw the same thing with same-sex marriage, right? It's really a lot of time like I think we're able to change minds very much, and we're able to personalize the issue and make people feel like we're human, right? Which is so sad, but it's a clearly a really important strategy. So today I think about like what kind of difficult conversations do people not want us to have, but we need to have? There are many. But the things that keep coming back to me from an LGBTQ contrast context is the trans rights,
Yep.
right? So also as a cisgender person who have benefited from all these years of struggle, mostly as a man, a cisgender man, like what is my responsibility, right? So the power I think of the AIDS activists was they were able to they're not picking the easiest fight. They are not picking the low they didn't pick the lowest hanging fruit. Instead, they really went for the hardest conversation and have those conversation. And by doing that, I think it lifted all boats in a way. So I felt like we need to keep having those conversations, even when it's hard, right? So that's a lesson that I drew from it. And the other one was joy. We need joy. We need community building and joy through community building, especially. We need creativity, because like these moments, I am pretty sure I'm still optimistic that it's not going to last forever. We will come out at the other end of the tunnel, and
Yeah.
joy and the community building is what will keep us together until then. So
I mean, I totally hear you on the joy part that, if I mean, if we can't do this with joy and love,
yeah,
we're not going to get very far. And I do hear you around humanizing,
yeah,
right? It's like I think what the right has been doing is demonizing either who we are, what we look like, how we dress, who we have sex with. And this is not just about queer people, like immigrants. It's like they're criminalizing people, or they're otherizing people so that you're afraid. And
yeah,
you're afraid of like gender queer people, you're afraid of immigrants, you're afraid of migrants, you're afraid of people who are not like you, but they're making an assumption about who you're supposed to be like, right?
right, right. When
So
you think about that time, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to ask when you think about that time in our history, does joy come to mind?
of course, because
Yeah,
it was a time period, in my life of partying, like going out, going to clubs, seeing people dancing, like uh doing that was a part of educating yourselves. So I just think about in the Bay Area, in New York and LA, a lot of the sex education were sex positive folks, women, queer women, who are showing, how to have sex using, a banana, putting a condom over the banana, and doing that, so that things become like, oh, how do we learn this? Like,
right.
they go and they teach you. You have these workshops on all these things.
Yeah. Sex got more deviant, right? Or fun in that
Or
way.
it just became like not even deviant. I think it just people normalized all that stuff. So it's not
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
right. Um,
Because what was most dangerous? It was penetrative sex.
yeah,
So there
right,
are ways of doing things that, that could be safe, but also a lot more fun than
right,
just, penetration.
right.
Right.
And there could be a number of different things. And I think this
Absolutely.
is like, um, what is it? Lesbians might have that, it's like, oh, what do lesbian, like, people are just like, they have these maybe misconceptions about like, oh, two women together, nothing happens, but like, no, lots can happen. Right? So I think there's just something around not knowing
Yeah,
that, having this information available to people. In the 80s, we didn't have the internet. We had magazines and things like that to kind of teach us. But I think technology, changes things in different ways. But I feel like I'm
sure.
getting off topic. Uh, Eric, I'm curious. You said that you write novels, and that you were thinking, maybe I'm not going to do the nonfiction, and you got back into writing uh this book, and now you're back into fiction. I'm curious about that kind of writing process for you. Do you feel there's something different between your nonfiction writing and your historical documentation?
Yeah. Um, yeah, yes and no. And I'll say this. I didn't know how to write this in the beginning because I was like, I'm not an academic. This is could be considered an academic endeavor.
Mhm.
And I tried the 5 chapter outline and they didn't work. It
Mhm.
just did not work, right? And I wasn't treating the narrators as people. I was treating as a point to make uh, uh, a certain sort of a pre-imposed timeline or things that I'm trying to impose on this story, right? So I kind of switched from having this sort of very academic approach to writing traditionally to just like I'm going to treat each one of this as a short story.
Oh,
So the book has 18 chapters. So I consider each of them a short story on its own, where the narrator is where the people I interview were the protagonists in these stories, right?
oh,
And yes, I provide some sociological context and historical context to all this stuff. We're talking about like building nonprofit organizations could be kind of dry and boring too, but that's the stuff that was happening in the community, right? Like you gotta like Dean talked about this all the time. Like you can't just be having fun and throwing parties and doing direct action all the time. Like at the end of the day, you still have to like write grants and write reports and document all this stuff, right? So, but I try to write it. I try to use a lot of creative fiction, creative writing strategies in writing this history. So in that way, it's not the same. But it's also different because obviously, like I, truth is the parameter. It still has to be true.
yeah,
So there's a little bit like there's a lot missing. There are a lot of things that I'm missing that I cannot fill out like that I would if I were creating something in my head, right? If I'm creating these characters, I can think about like how they would react in a situation. Um, like one of the stories involving that really sexist incident that we were referring to earlier involved someone who passed away, right?
yep.
And he was central figure in perpetrating that sexism. But at the
Mhm.
same time, like he was also instrumental in so many different struggles in a positive way, right? So I don't know if he what reconciliation he might have since that incident. I couldn't talk to him because he passed away. I couldn't talk to him. So I have to so I don't know I didn't know what to do. I can make things up, right? So I just have to talk about my own limitation in telling the story.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that because I think what it shows us is because with history and hindsight, you could you're talking to people about a certain time period and then they're thinking about it in their current state about 20 years ago I was young and dumb or something or like yeah we were all at a certain point and we make mistakes, we have regrets, and I'm assuming that basically your history book is about humanity, right? It's like how
Yeah,
human we are, and humans are all flawed, and we are, in progress, and we will make mistakes and we'll continue to make mistakes. And I think it's interesting because to have you think about that person who had that incident and said something, did something very sexist, and then later they are doing really great things as well, right? And so
right.
we don't have to negate each other. I don't think it's like a zero sum game. I think mainly it's just like it shows the complexity of a human life. Like we're making mistakes and hopefully people can forgive us if we take accountability.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That was a hard chapter to write too. Yeah,
I
I
can
should have written
imagine.
it down. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, for folks who have not read the book, Eric, what would you how would you entice them to get the book and to read it? Like what's because for me it not only documents a certain time period, but also it documents things that we just don't know about Asian Americans. We don't know about much about Asian American LGBTQ people still. Um, you could see somebody like Bowen Yang on TV, but that doesn't tell you
Yeah.
about this kind of history, right?
Yeah.
Or even Margaret Cho and like just popular Asian LGBTQ people, but the history of things is not, they're not, speaking to that or talking about that. So I'm just curious, for you, how would you um, give me that like
Yeah.
compelling thumbnail about, why it's important to have these kinds of books written?
Yeah. Um, I think you were saying, I mean that what you said resonated with me because for me, oral history is not just about recovering stories, right? But there's a I would even say a political project to it. And
Mhm.
it's not just about representation, right? And for me, some of the things that I continue to learn from it, that I hope that I can, and that this is not to say that the folks in the 90s did it perfectly and there's a blueprint. And I think, in fact, the fact that there was not a blueprint and people have to create and do things and experiment, and even when it's, could be controversial, even they might have detractors. People just have to do whatever they needed to come up with, be creative and don't fall. I mean, right now we talk about a lot of evidence-based, and I'm not, you know, saying that that's a bad thing, but there's also something to be said about the creativity that came from um, necessity, came from just community imagination,
Mhm.
so um, and it's no coincidence that it's young people at the time, as it is now, that is like carrying that torch, right? Because I think for those of us who've been doing this, we have a certain way of doing things now that might not work. I mean, obviously it didn't work because we are in Trump 2.0. So I think that sense of creativity and for me as someone who is now in the middle age, to allow room for young people to experiment, it's important. And I think that's what these activists did, right? So they would never say, do it like I did, as we did 30 years ago. In fact, chart your own path. So I think that's tremendously a powerful story, right?
Eric, you and I, we could talk a lot about oral history and about archival research. I wonder if you could touch briefly on the archival research that you did for this book, and where did you find this information? Like where is it kept? Like, who has it? How did that process go?
Yeah, so I got a small fellowship from the One Institute in Los Angeles, which is affiliated with USC now. And they gave me some money. I was able to do some research. The staff was super friendly. Like every time I go over there, I ask them like, this is what I'm looking at. And I want to look at this box, right? Because it's all online. They tells you which box is what, right? So, and by the time I get there, the box will be out there waiting for me. And it was really wonderful. Um, and other scholars have talked about this too, but there's also like so much that is not in the archives, right? When you think about who gets to like collect things, right? And a lot of things is very official documents. So who is not part of that official history, right? So there's a lot of gaps in the archives too, and some people even call it sort of the archival violence, right? Like all these missing things that stop us from telling our stories. So it was a challenge. Oh, by the way, APIT also had like drawers full of information that I was able to go through. I was at their office like for about a year, almost like a couple times a month just to go through their stuff. So there's stuff out there and it's helpful. It's
Yeah,
helpful. It's very contextual and sometimes, especially the official documents can be pretty dry. So you have to go through it and make sense of it and then
yeah.
figure out like how does this fit into the story that I'm trying to tell of like human lives.
Yeah. But I'm glad that, APIT has kept their records, their documentation, because sometimes when you're an organization, you're just doing the work and you're not thinking about, oh, this flyer, that, a lot of the ephemera, which I find, can you put a date, but just also put the year because you never know what year this flyer is from. So
So true.
it's like I hate that. So for me, it's just like I'm always putting, a date, like the year in which this was
Right.
put in. So at
Right.
least
This conference happened in May 6th.
I
Which
know.
year?
I know. Graphically, I understand, like design wise, maybe you don't want to add a lot of text, but I'm like, you just add the year.
That
That'll
is so true.
in the future. But it makes me think about, like especially now with the erasure of history, the taking down of certain things, websites being scrubbed. Um, what
Mhm.
what do you think is needed for people to make sure that the archives aren't or don't have gaps? Because I have lots of boxes of stuff, and I'm
Mhm.
always just trying to figure out what to do with those.
Yeah, and you and I have been in that conversation several years ago about like community archives, and it's a lot of work. And it's not
Yeah,
just, here's a storage room and here are some boxes and just leave it in there until someone could figure it out, right? You have to catalog it, you have to make sure there's the right temperature and lighting has to be a certain way, and it's complicated, and which is really nice to have folks like One Archives to sort of give advice around that, right? Um, and I'm curious about like I'm seeing some efforts in the community to document some of this history, right? So I'm thinking about Lavender Phoenix,
yeah,
the Bay Area, who's been doing this, was it a dragon fruit
yeah,
history
yeah,
project?
yeah.
Yeah, that I think Amy Suyoshi had a lot to do with the beginning of that. I don't know if they are still involved in it. But just having I mean, it could be such an intergenerational thing. It could be such a alive thing, right? To have younger people talking to folks who are older and just sort of having that conversation is, um, I think we need to kind of also figure out what this intergenerational dialogue really means, right? That doesn't delve devolve into like, this is what happened, and it just could be just very one way and prescriptive,
Yeah.
so I think there are a lot of things that people are it's exciting to think that we have generations even as they're being erased, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm just sort of leaning into like the possibility of it. Yeah.
And for me, like I think we're now that melder generation, like we're
Yeah.
middle elders now, and there's younger people, different generations coming up after us, and there's ones who have been ahead. I think for me, I'm always thinking about the people who passed. Like you talked about Dean Goishi,
Yeah.
they're no longer here. So many, like for me, and I think for you, part of the reason I think that was great about your book is that you documented their story before they passed on, and
Yeah.
um I worry about that a lot because, I know people in their 70s and 80s and they're retired,
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh, have they been interviewed? And yes, there are different projects that have interviewed them or videotaped them, etc. So I'm like, oh, thank God for that. There's the visibility project that Mia Nakano's put together. There's just different things around.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And to me, I also like you think about the different generations so that we can be in conversation with each other and not like, oh, let me tell you about the good old days. It's like, no, I think what we would just want to share with each other is life stories and how we survived or how we're thriving now or it's just sharing with each other as opposed to um taking away from the
Yeah.
older generation. It's like, oh, let me have your wisdom. I think we both have, or we have different kinds of wisdoms going back and forth. So
Yeah.
way.
One more thing I want to say about the archive too is when at the end of this project, I have all these recordings and transcript.
Yeah.
They're all digital.
Mhm.
Um, the recordings are digital. And I thought about like, do I want to give this over to one or maybe the UCLA Asian American Studies Center or both or, so I ended up like just staying in the APIT. And I realized that part of the decision is there were a lot of stuff in there that I don't know. Even people gave me consent.
Yep.
I wasn't sure that I want to make it that available to the public. I'm glad, especially now, and things could be weaponized against you, right? So, and people are still alive. So these are oral history of, so that was another consideration. Like also things that were said that there was some disagreement, there was some tension that was never resolved. I don't want to dredge it up again, by people listening to these without context sometimes. So there was a lot of like reservations about just making this archive available. So I kind of left it like this is yours. This is APIT's property. So you decide what to do with it because a lot of it is really their history. So that might be a chicken way out, but it was really hard to think about how to make it, as an oral historian, you were taught
Yeah,
to make this available, right?
exactly.
So yeah.
Well, no, I think that just speaks to like the seriousness of what we do with what we gather
Yeah.
and how do we have permission to do it, even if you have written permission. I have written permissions from like, the 90s, but it's like 2025 now, and it's like, oh, okay, I think it can. And at one point you and I had talked about like, oh, what if we create, or you were thinking of creating, a podcast from these oral histories so that they could be available and accessible to people in a way that you don't have to go to an archive to listen to, but you could just like have a podcast. So I think there's different
Yeah.
platforms now that are available to people that we didn't have in the past. And I think there's uh more of an appetite and interest for that too with podcasts and because documentary takes a little bit more for film, but a podcast is relatively easier, and you can kind of put it out very quickly. Have you thought about that, right?
We got a grant from CAC, from the California Arts Council, to do like 3 episodes. I think we could go do 2 episodes, but I think we got more funding to do a third one. So it is on, I don't know if it's still on the APIT website, but it's because they
Ah,
kind of rebranded, but it's still on my writer's app website, the
oh, okay.
ericwattworks.com.
Oh, well,
So
that's great.
but there are only 3 episodes. It is still a lot of work and yeah, yeah.
But I'm
But it
glad
was,
you did it.
yeah.
And I'm glad that people can go to your website to take a
Yes,
look.
that's right. Thank you for mentioning that. That's right. Yeah.
And so, can you tell me what you're working on these days?
Um,
New
you know,
projects.
I'm always writing. There's always like things in my drawer, as it happens with other writers too, that's unfinished. I always want to, put an ending to it at some point, So I am working on an unfinished novel. It was getting too complicated, but I'm also working on a series of going back to nonfiction, a series of creative nonfiction essays, uh,
Mm,
almost memoirish, um, that I'm calling the Introvert's Guide to American Holidays. I'm trying to lean to my humor a little bit more.
great.
Yeah, because humor is, I think, something that kind of shows up in my writing, even when it's very serious. But I haven't really done it intentionally, and it's really hard.
Mhm.
So I kind of want to just hone that, in my next writing adventure.
Oh, that sounds. And tell us about the book that you just published. And are you doing
Yeah,
events
yeah.
and book signings at places?
So it's called Daddy Issues. It's a collection of short stories. It's published by the University of Nebraska. Like Suhaili said, it won an award. So that's how it got published. So I was very happy about that. I'm also especially happy that the book itself, the collection itself, spanned probably a couple decades because I've been writing short stories since I was, a teenager. But some of them, I mean, a lot of them, like the stuff is within the last 20 years, so it didn't go back that far. So it's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. Um, but it's really nice to be able to see the breadth of my work in one collection. So that's really nice. I'm going to be in Palm Springs on November 1st. They have a literary festival called Pride on the Page. So I'll be talking about that book in particular. And I'll be at UC Irvine in November 18th. Yeah.
Great.
All of this is on my website too.
Okay. Thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate
Thank
this.
you, Alice. It's
And
such a challenging month for you. I mean, so I have so much going on at work and personally. And this is so fun, but I know it's also a lot of work for you, so I appreciate it.
of
And the
course.
museum too, my God.
Yeah, I totally. So I'm going to pass it back to Suhaili, who'll tell you more about the museum. And thanks everybody who was here on our little webinar conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening, and we look forward to welcoming you at upcoming programs at the American LGBTQ Museum. Bye.